Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this great time of adversity, but it's also a great time of opportunity. And I think that Ken Chenault will illuminate that during his chat today. It's an honor for you to join us in our very first virtual fireside chat with the iconic business leader, Ken Chenault. This fireside chat is brought to you by SAP and RBC Capital Markets, our longtime partners in the Silicon Valley Culture Shifting Weekend. It's now in its 6th year, and as many of you know, Ken was going to join us in April when we were supposed to have the event, but due to COVID-19, the new date is September 10th through 13th, which will be virtual, so please save the date on your calendars for that. I'm also excited to have our friend Caroline Clarke, Chief Brand Officer, Women of Power, Black Enterprise, who will lead the discussion with Ken today, and my partner Denmark West of Connectivity Capital Partners, who will make closing remarks. And finally, a special thank you to Ken and Caretha Coleman and Reggie Van Lee for helping to make Ken's appearance possible. It was 3 years in the making, and I could honestly say well worth it. There'll be a Q&A at the end of Ken's chat, so be sure to use the Q&A chat box to provide your questions, and we'll let you know when that opens up. Since our community is so spirited and connects in ways that enable deals and collaborations, as you heard from the opening video, which is our mission for Culture Shifting Weekends, please use the chat function on the side to connect with each other, share your LinkedIn profiles. If you have job opportunities, board and C-suite, if you are an investor, angel investor, venture, private equity, and you're writing checks for entrepreneurs, venture investors, please share that as well. And any other opportunities to meet one another and enjoy the conversation. We have about 200 guests on the line with us today, and I'd like to give a shout out to a couple of people that are joining us near and far. Benga Oibode, investor, philanthropist, and lawyer, as well as board member at Carnegie Hall, Jazz at Lincoln Center, and the Ford Foundation is calling in from Lagos, Nigeria. John Utendahl, Bank of America Vice Chairman. We also have Kevin Lofton and Lloyd Dean, co-CEOs of Common Spirit. Michael Carter from RBC Capital Markets. We have the legendary Susan Taylor, former editor and chief of Essence Magazine and founder of National Care's mentoring movement. We also have Byron Boston, the president and CEO of Dynex Capital. Damian Atkins, general counsel at the Hershey Company. Lisa Lambert, chief technology and innovation officer at National Grid and founder of Upward Women. Robin Washington, former CFO at Gilead and board member at Salesforce and Alphabet. Shelley Archambault, former CEO MetricStream, and David Carey, SVP, Public Affairs and Communications at Hearst. And then finally, Ted Colbert, CEO of Boeing Global Services. But with 200 of you on the line, there's many, many important people and business leaders that are with us today. So thank you all again for joining us. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to Judith Williams, who is the head of People Sustainability and SVP and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at SAP. Judith, take it away.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for the opportunity to introduce our guests, and also thanks to you for all the amazing work that you've done to build this community and to champion inclusion. I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing first Ken Chenault. Ken Chenault is the chairman and managing director of the venture capital firm General Catalyst. As managing director of the firm, he focuses on investing in fast-growing companies that have the potential to become large, fundamental institutions. Prior to joining General Catalyst, Ken was the chairman and chief executive officer of American Express Company, a position he held from 2001 to 2018. He joined American Express in 1981 as Director of Strategic Planning and subsequently served in a number of increasingly senior positions, including Vice Chairman and President and Chief Operating Officer until his appointment as CEO. Ken also has been active on boards, currently serving on the boards of Airbnb, Berkshire Hathaway, Chief Guild of Education, and my favorite, the Harvard Corporation. He also serves on the board of governors for the NCAA and is also on the board of numerous nonprofit organizations. I just want to share a personal shout out and story. I remember very clearly when Mr. Chenault became the CEO of American Express, because that's when I actually learned what a CEO was. I was a literature professor at the time, but his example inspired me as it did so many other young up and coming people. And even though he and I have never met before, it's unlikely that I would have had the courage to leave academia for the corporate world, or that I would have the position that I do today were it not for Mr. Chenault showing me what was possible. And so it is my great honor to welcome you today. I also have the pleasure of introducing Caroline Clarke. Caroline Clarke is an award-winning journalist who has spent most of her career at the media company Black Enterprise, where she is currently Chief Brand Officer, Women of Power. Ms. Clarke co-founded the brand in 2005, and since its launch, it has consistently been the company's growth leader. Comprised primarily of an annual conference, the Women of Power Summit, and a syndicated television show, Women of Power TV, the brand exists to give women of color, entrepreneurs, managers, and corporate executives the heightened visibility, validation, and access to information and individuals that they need to advance in their careers. Ms. Clarke is also an author. Her most recent book is the highly acclaimed memoir, Postcards from Cookie. I do want to recognize the importance of the Women of Power platform, because while so much research has shown us that women of color are the most ambitious when it comes to looking for bigger jobs in corporate America, they are most likely to start businesses, they are the least likely to be promoted in corporate America, and they're also the least likely to get venture funding. So thank you, Ms. Clarke, for making sure that we are seen and that we see each other. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Judith, so much. Really appreciate you. Thank you, Andrea, and Denmark, and all of you out there watching us. And most of all, thank you to Ken. Ken, can you join us?
Absolutely.
How are you?
Great to see you, Caroline. And it's great to hear that there are so many friends with us today. And I also just want to give my thanks to Andrea and Reggie Van Lee and Caritha and Ken Coleman for making sure that I was here. And I've tried to be here the last few years. The dates didn't work out, but I'm glad it's all worked out. And I'm glad you're the person that's going to conduct the conversation.
Well, you're not happier than me. We're so thrilled that it all worked out. Let's start off with a quote. Let's jump right in. This quote might sound a little familiar to you because it's yours. It is not the strongest species that survive, not the most intelligent, but the ones most adaptive to change. We are sitting here in the midst of just a rip-roaring, rollicking good time, aren't we? We're conducting this conference virtually from Oakland and New York and all parts across the globe rather than in the same room. When you talk about adaptability to change, how have the last 10 weeks felt to you? And what have you learned about yourself in this period?
So I think, Caroline, clearly, as people probably know, the author of the quote, I use it a lot, is Charles Darwin. But I use it because I think part of both the opportunity and challenge for all of us is to adapt. And the reality is, we all know you can be incredibly intelligent. You can really be focused, but if you don't have the ability and the resilience to adapt, you're not going to be successful. For me, the way I would talk about the environment that we're in, it's horrific. It is scary. Someone who led a company through 9/11 and the financial crisis, the way I talk about it, this is like 9/11, the financial crisis by a multiple of 3. And it is something that is hard to imagine that we would be in this situation. But what I do believe in times of crisis, that's really where you find out what your values are and what your beliefs are. And I frankly believe that you should use a crisis to fortify yourself. And you've got to think through, in my judgment, the mantra that I use for leadership, which is the role of a leader is to define reality and give hope. And so I think you've got to be very transparent, very accepting of what we don't know, because the level of uncertainty is really troubling that we all have. But I think what we've got to look at, what are those areas that we can control? And I think a lot of what we can control are our behaviors and the actions that we take. And then frankly, what we have to do is we have to imagine what it will be like to get to the other side and what that will mean. And what is the definition of the new normal going forward.
Yeah. You mentioned 9/11, and during your tenure at American Express, you led this organization through an extraordinary number of changes and crises, reorganizations, with tremendous resiliency and vision. You mentioned 9/11. As you think about that time in transforming this organization, really from a credit card company to the expansive, iconic brand that we now all know, is 9/11 the moment that most relates to what we're dealing with now? And what did you learn specifically during those times? And how did you sort of work that muscle to become very adaptable to a succession of changes? Because that's what we're all doing now and going to have to do going forward. Were you always so adaptable, or was that something you intentionally had to work on?
I think you learn how to be adaptable, and some of it is how you are raised, what experiences you've had growing up. I would say fundamentally for me, growing up as an African American, being born pre-Brown v. Board of Education, because I was born in 1951, being a student during the 70s, being in high school during the 60s, so the civil rights movement, the Vietnam era, growing up in a Black neighborhood, going to a predominantly white school, understanding how to adapt, having parents who talk to us about the importance of having a commitment to your community, but also being very focused on what you can do to be a better person. And I will tell you that the 9/11 experience for me was one that I looked back on, because when you're going through it, you don't really know. And so some of the lessons there, where I think from a leadership standpoint in a crisis, you have to be both decisive and compassionate. You have to demonstrate empathy, because people are going through tremendous anxiety. And I think one of the real issues that we are dealing with is not having enough leaders who, in fact, combine a level of decisiveness, that are action-oriented, that are willing to take accountability, but also demonstrate accountability. And so I think from a leadership standpoint, in a crisis for a leader, one of my mantras is, if you want to lead, you have to be willing to serve. And the attitude I think you have to display in the behavior is that you're really in the service of others. And so I think when I compare the situation we're in now to 9/11, certainly the emotional impact left me very raw. Obviously, over 3,000 people died in the attack on the World Trade Center. American Express lost 11 of our colleagues. But if we look at the casualties, that pales in comparison to what we're dealing with now. So the divide in our country, the stark relief that we're seeing, the disproportionate impact on Black and brown people is horrifying. So I would say that the learnings for me was focus on some things that you can control. Act, don't freeze. And that happens in a crisis as people freeze. You've got to be willing to take action, to be decisive, to take accountability, but also to communicate a real analysis of the situation that you're in. But I go back to giving people, here are some short-term steps, and here is how we will get through this crisis. And here's what part of the other, when we get to the other side, here are elements of what it will look like.
Part of what I think is magnifying our anxiety in this moment is that there is a leadership void, right? You're talking about strong, clear, decisive, compassionate leadership. And we have an issue with that in this country, in corporate America, and all the way up the food chain. You mentioned timing and the fortuitousness of your timing in life from the very beginning, where you came through and the historical markers along the way. One of the benefits of your timing is that I know you've had the extraordinary opportunity to be a beneficiary of extraordinary leaders pouring into you from a young age when you were just coming up in business. Some, the leading pioneers in business in this country who are African American, and really an exceptional peer group who was tracking along with you to break through barriers that had completely existed for generations before. Can we sort of hit a couple of people? I'll say some names and you can quickly tell us what you gleaned from them that helped shape the leader that you became. Let's start out with, everybody's favorite elder statesman, Vernon Jordan.
So Vernon is an absolutely amazing person. What I say about Vernon is he was one of the first crossover artists in business. So here is someone who grew up and was a civil rights leader who was able to transform himself to be an outstanding business leader, but he retained his core values. He retained his commitment to our people. And he is someone who is always trying to nurture and develop people. So Vernon has a gift, and he is an incredible nurturer of people. The first time I had an extended meeting with Vernon was I was coming up in the company, and I think I had been promoted to senior vice president. And Vernon called me and invited me to breakfast at the Regency, a breakfast that lasted 5 hours. And he regaled me with stories, with his experience. He gave me terrific advice. And that relationship is a relationship that I deeply cherish. And he's had a major impact on me because what I saw with Vernon is his willingness to help people.
What's the most impactful advice he gave you?
Hmm?
What's the most impactful advice he's given you? Best advice Vernon
Yes,
gave
so
you?
I would say the best advice that Vernon has given me is one, what he has consistently said to me is do what you feel in your gut. You know what's right. You know what's right for you. Don't let anyone dissuade you from your judgment of what you think. Listen to people. You might change, but deep down, follow your instincts. And I would say the second thing that Vernon has said to me is help people. You want to be happy? One of Vernon's great sayings is that friendship is the medicine of life.
I could list a lot of people who I know have poured into you. The late Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, I know was a dear friend, and you guys held each other up. Ursula Burns, you have quite the running crew.
Right.
Ted Wells. Is there a person, and it may be someone whose name is not readily recognizable, who really, in your business career, so I know your parents are impactful, but during your business career has really been there to help you in those moments of tremendous crisis and growth?
Look, aside from my parents and obviously Kathy, I've, to your point, I've benefited from the support and friendships of literally hundreds of people. And I stand on their shoulders, some very famous people, but some people that you've never heard of and would not be viewed as icons, but were instrumental in my success. But I would tell you, Carolyn, the person who probably has had the most influence on my business career and life, and particularly when I'm thinking about how to navigate through a crisis, whether it's a personal challenge or a business challenge, is Nelson Mandela. And I had the opportunity to meet him 3 times, but what has always been inspiring to me is here is someone who was incarcerated for a significant part of his life. And in that period, he fortified himself and got stronger. And that, to me, the ability to transcend the environment you're in, whenever I'm going through a crisis or challenge, I think of him and the fact that he fortified himself and got stronger. That gives me tremendous hope. And so he's probably been the most influential person for me.
You know, there was a lot of excitement when you left American Express and turned your sights on Silicon Valley. And most notably, a lot was made of the fact that you were coming to join the Facebook and Airbnb boards. And I know you said you really wanted to make an impact on diversity and inclusion here. If you had to give the tech sector a grade right now on progress made in diversity and inclusion, what would it be?
C- to a D.
And why is that?
Because I don't think that there has been a consistent, enduring effort. And the reality is that one of the frustrations that I have, and let me be clear, I think in general in business, we are still not taking advantage of the opportunities that are there from a diversity standpoint. But on the technology side, technology is an enabler, a major enabler. And so you have some of the same people who will say, I'm a disruptor, but when it comes to diversity, they're accepting the status quo. And in certain respects, they're worse than some of the legacy companies. And they're young. So the reality is that what's very, very important is a recognition, in my view, that if you want to build an enduring company, then you have to be committed to bringing about major change in our society and transforming it. And I don't see enough leadership that is focused on really changing the technology sector and bringing forth a concerted, enduring effort on diversity.
What do you think that resistance is rooted in? Because, you know, to your point, this is a sector that prides itself on being a disruptor, on being innovative, on being brilliant. So what is the resistance? Where is it rooted?
You know, I'm not fully sure, but I would say, number one, I don't think there is the level of commitment to what can I do that will really make a meaningful difference in people's lives. And if you just have an attitude that you're going to disrupt and you're going to come out with a product and service, but the world will take care of itself, that's really not enough. So one is, I think you've got to have a broader mindset that technology is an enabler. We, in fact, have to use technology to improve society more broadly. I think that people need a level of awareness of what is going on, what are the issues, what are the problems. So, you know, in certain cases, when you have people who have grown up in a narrow environment, and that's the reality. They've not had exposure to different types of people. The networks, and technology is no different from other sectors in business, the networks are pretty small. And so you get this false sense of meritocracy because you're just talking to the same people like you. And you're not aware of the talent that's out there.
Yeah.
And so I think what is important is, I think that the leaders of technology companies, the members of the board, employees, this has to be non-negotiable. That commitment to diversity has to be real. The focus on representation, the focus on a range of opportunities. We've got to continue to drive it. But I would say that the level of awareness and accountability is not where it needs to be, to give me enough confidence that we're going to make the progress that we need to.
You say we have to continue to drive it. What can groups and individuals do to accelerate progress and, you know, increase accountability? Because this is such a deeply entrenched problem. And, you know, you've been immersed now in the Valley for a couple of years. Is it moving? Is it changing? Are there bright spots?
So, you know, I think there's some movement, but I would have to say across the board, not enough progress. It's, you know, I've got to be transparent. And, you know, I think in certain respects, the numbers are going the wrong way rather than the right way. And I think what can be done is, one, as I said, I think there has to be continued focus on the top leadership of technology companies. And I think you got to look through the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is venture capital firms are not diverse enough. A number of startups are not diverse enough. Obviously, technology companies are not diverse enough. So what are the changes we're making in each of those categories? So the focus of both awareness, but also challenging the top leadership to, in fact, put in programs, put in initiatives and targets. I think, secondly, where we have African Americans in leadership positions, you've got to advocate in your company, but also what you need to do is you need to look at your own department, your own category, and say, what am I doing to help advance people in my company? And then, very importantly, and this is something I believe in very strongly, you got to go to white executives and tell them that's part of their accountability. So one of the things, frankly, I did at American Express is for our African American diversity group, I actually said in the beginning, people were saying, well, we got to put an African American executive. I said, no, I'm going to put a white executive as the sponsor because I want him or her accountable for making progress, just as I want the rest of you accountable. And so the shared accountability and responsibility is very, very important.
Yeah. Your transition away from the Facebook board to Berkshire Hathaway, can you talk about that transition and, sort of what your decision-making process is as you map your career and where you're going to stick and where you're going to move?
Yeah, I think Berkshire was a unique opportunity that I've been fortunate over the years. I met Warren Buffett my first year as CEO of the company. And at that time, he owned 13%. And by the time I left, he owned close to 25% of the company. And we developed a strong relationship and a very strong personal relationship. And when Bill Gates decided to step down, Warren came to me, and I had really looked forward to the opportunity to work with him because he's an amazing person, and he's someone who I respect in business, is a friend. And what I've just decided personally for me, Caroline, is I only wanted to be on 2 boards. And so when the opportunity came at Berkshire, 2 public boards, I decided that I would move to Berkshire. And that's really the reason.
Will you remain engaged with Facebook as you talk about these issues of diversity in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I absolutely. Oh yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. I will stay. I'm going to stay very engaged because, again, this is not a year effort or a 2-year effort or a 3-year effort. I think we got to keep pushing and pushing.
Yeah. When I interviewed you for my first book, it's almost 20 years ago, you quoted Frederick Douglass, who said that the destiny of Black America is the destiny of America. With recent events, including, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, not to mention, you mentioned this earlier, the incredible disparities in healthcare, in education, in economics, that particularly impact African Americans and that are becoming magnified by the crisis that we're in with this pandemic. What do you foresee for the destiny of America? What, compared to when we spoke about this all those years ago, you've now retired from American Express, you've left the Facebook board, you're engaged in all these things. How has your sense about our destiny changed, and what is your greatest hope and how we can achieve that?
So let me first say, I still believe in our people. and I still believe that we're going to get to the other side. Again, one of the things that Vernon Jordan would often say to me and has said about what we're dealing with now with COVID-19 is, despite all the obstacles, we somehow have figured out how to manage through. And so the history is my hope that we will manage through. But as I look at the impact of COVID-19, I'll just give you a few points that I've been reflecting on. Is one, that the impact, as we know, not just on Black and brown people, but people who in fact have no choice where they live and no choice about what they have to do from an employment standpoint, the impact is absolutely disproportionate, and the divide has gotten even wider. In fact, the head of the Fed, Powell, I think it was yesterday or the day before, in his remarks, gave a statistic that I think is really alarming, that nearly 40% of the people who were working in February and were members of households making less than $40,000 a year had lost their jobs in March. That is frightening. And I think that one of the areas, if we talk about technology, and I certainly understand the issues, but you have the knowledge workers saying, we're not going to return to our physical location. One of the implications of that is the knowledge workers, and many of us are in that category, the view is you stay home and we'll let the disadvantaged people be the food tasters, and they'll tell us based on what their casualty rate is when it's time for us to go back to work physically. And so I think what we absolutely have to do is we've got to address this stark divide. We have to acknowledge the disproportionate impact. We have to put in the strategies and tactics that will allow us to deal with the issues today, but also the issues when COVID subsides. And I think what that means is, as we think about our political candidates and who we are supporting and getting out the vote, but also as important as getting out the vote is what are the strategies and the tactics that people are going to be putting in place. So I think, Caroline, it's incredibly challenging. But what I would say is we can't despair. We have to recognize that these problems are complex, they're incredibly challenging. But I go back to Nelson Mandela, I go back to all those people who came before us, and I believe ultimately we have the adaptability and the resilience and the strength that we're going to figure out a way to get to the other side.
We have an audience question. What opportunities do you see arising in the technology industry due to coronavirus, and how can we collaborate to drive better outcomes for the future?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, part of what one has to reimagine, and I'll go through a few areas, is workforce education. I think and workforce education and training and reskilling, I think is a tremendous opportunity for technology, because the reality is that the skills needed, we know are changing. COVID actually accelerated those trends. And so the opportunity for online education and the role that technology can play in that, I think is tremendous. So one of the reasons, frankly, why I made the firm's General Catalyst's largest investment that we've ever done was in a company called Guild Education that is focused on transforming workforce education. And I think that opportunity is being accelerated. What we're seeing in healthcare, telehealth, it's just absolutely amazing what is happening. And I think that the opportunities there are very significant. Certainly what we're seeing in online delivery and services, that's going to be and is a significant opportunity. I think we're going to have to reimagine the travel industry. Just as we did after 9/11, there were changes that came about in the industry. I think small business is going to need to be transformed. What are the services? What are the platforms? What are the capabilities that we need to develop? So I think, frankly, almost every industry is going to need to be reimagined. And I do think from a technology standpoint, one of the things that I think needs to fundamentally change is when people in technology talk about the fact that they're going to disrupt, it goes back to an earlier point I made. They're also saying, I'm not responsible for the implications of what happens. And I think one of the things that needs to happen for technology in general is that because of AI, because of the information access that we have, we need to better understand the implications of the products and the services and the capabilities and the impacts on the broader society at the start rather than after the fact. Yeah. And so I think that is an area that brings opportunity both in business, but also understanding the impact on the broader society.
Danny Allen is asking if this is a moment of opportunity for investing in entrepreneurs in our own communities, and should we be coming together to fund and executive mentor these firms?
Yes, I think one of the things, Caroline, and you know, this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I've been involved in a range of initiatives and investment opportunities. I do think that this is a time to both support our existing institutions and firms, but also to encourage entrepreneurial activity because, and I feel this in all categories of business, is the opportunities, particularly for people who look like us, is when there is uncertainty, is when the environment is in disarray. When everything is working well, you don't find people saying, boy, I really need to advance this person. What happens more in a crisis is they'll say, this is the person who probably is the best one to put in place. Now, let me be clear. We don't have enough people in the pipeline. That doesn't happen enough. But I do think there are more opportunities for entrepreneurs, but we have to get access to the capital. And that is still a small network of getting access to that capital. So we've got to expand those opportunities.
Delvin Worthy is asking you to talk about some of the impactful partnerships that you've developed or seen that have been particularly meaningful to you as we look to create unique partnerships during a time like this. How did you learn how to go about that, and how do we do that?
So it's this broad partnerships, diverse partnerships. Carol, I just want to be as responsive as I can be.
I think this is partnerships within unique partnerships for business or social impact, some that you have developed that could inform how people would do this now.
So let me just, from a social impact and a business impact standpoint, is during the financial crisis, I was very concerned about the impact on small business. And we developed, American Express developed an initiative called Small Business Saturday that really expanded, that brought together private and public partnerships. And what was very important about this partnership is we worked with city, state, and federal. And we worked with a Republican administration and a Democratic administration. And we were able to build significant momentum. And we also had a focus on minorities because small business is really a pathway. And that program is still in existence. What was critical was that I decided it would not just be an American Express branded program. And actually, in support of small business, we allowed any payment product to be used as long as people were supporting small business. And then we worked with government authorities, mayors, governors, presidents, to really push that through. I think there are examples. IBM, I think, has done some terrific things with educational programs. And we all know, both on an individual basis and a corporate basis, the number of partnerships, private-public partnerships with schools, all levels of schools. And I think that's very powerful. There are environmental partnerships. So I think one of the things that has to happen in this environment is we have to reinvent how we go about partnerships. One of the things I've seen in the crisis, not just from a diversity standpoint, but just dealing with the issues, is we've got to have broader partnerships across companies to drive some of the initiatives and change and progress that we need.
Jackie wants to know, well, a few people have actually asked about this. How do you deal with the pain of the expanding wealth gap, particularly now, given what's happening? And as you spoke earlier about reimagining the future, what can we do to help ease that pain as we move toward the other side of this?
So I think let's look at the current situation that we're in. And as I talked about, the disproportionate impact. One example that I think was a very, very powerful effort that is continuing, and I give Scott Mills and Marva Smalls and Charles Phillips and Fred Terrell and Bill Lewis, is the BET COVID effort. And I think that close to $18 million was raised, but I also contrast that, which I think is laudable and terrific, is Robin Hood, I think, raised $115 million. And hopefully a good percentage of that will go to disadvantaged sectors of our society. But I think one of the things that we've got to do is marshal our resources. So the reality is the efforts which are there in the African American community, those of us who have some advantages, what I would say from an accountability standpoint, part of what you got to do is examine and not wait for someone else to act, is what are you doing to support those organizations and initiatives, not just financially, but what are the capabilities, what are the skills, what are you bringing there? I think secondly is I do think that education and supporting different educational programs, supporting our schools. I mean, what's happening in our communities with our schools That's another area where I think we've got to provide not just our financial support, but our business support. How are we getting our companies engaged in the communities that really need to have the support, the tools, computers? I think there are some basic things that we need to do. And obviously, from a political standpoint, there are organizations. BA is an organization that I think is very focused on economic empowerment and political empowerment. I think we got to get involved and engaged. I mean, this is not one where there is one action that we should take, but I would say there are organizations that exist today, and I think we've got to get more involved, and we can't wait for someone else to do it for us. At the same time, we have to make all parties more accountable and responsible. And part of that is in this next election, we've got to make sure we get out the vote.
Yeah. You mentioned actions that we can take. There's a question about what, as the builders of businesses, should be avoided, particularly during this time. You've managed companies through multiple crises. What are some of the most common mistakes you saw that you feel people should really be careful of avoiding?
All right, so what I would say, as far as any organization, frankly, profit or nonprofit, is one, what you have to do is make a realistic assessment of the situation that your organization is in. In a crisis like we're in, cash is king. So you need to be real clear with respect to your ability to stay liquid. That's really important. Do not have a hope that in 3 months things are going to get better. Part of what you got to do is you got to go through a range of scenarios and say, what are some worst case scenarios that I put in place? How do I design my strategies so I can deal with that? I think secondly, you've got to define what are some key business and financial objectives, and I call them signposts, that will give you confidence that you're headed in the right direction. And they should be both signposts from the external marketplace as well as signposts for your own business metrics. And then third, what I think is very important is you've got to think about what are some of the opportunities that are out there. So this gets back to the reinvention. This gets back to selectively investing, because if you're just thinking purely defensively, you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to miss the opportunity. And so I believe in a crisis, you stand still, you fall back. And so it's very important that you've got to have this balance of saying, frankly, what do I need to do to survive? What do I need to do to stabilize? And then you have to say, what do I need to do to, in fact, grow? And I may not grow this year or next year, but when the crisis abates, I want to have the game plan put in place that I'm coming out of that crisis stronger.
Final question, and this is one that Culture Shift always asks. You've got this incredibly accomplished and engaged community here at your beck and call. What is something that we can do to help you achieve some of the objectives that you are now pursuing?
So what I would say, first of all, what you can do that will help me achieve my objectives is take care of yourself and fortify yourself. Really think about what you need to do to be the best you can be as we go through and come out of this crisis. I think secondly, let me know what are some of your ideas for how we can improve diversity. Give me some best practices, but I'd really like those best practices tied to results, because I'm a firm believer that The way you got to judge progress is outcomes. And I think if we can leverage the collective network that we have, and the last piece that I would say is get engaged, because you can make an incredible difference. Get engaged in dealing with the impact of COVID on our communities. Get engaged in advancing both the business agenda, and the business and the diversity agenda needs to be part of the business agenda of any organization that you're involved in. Don't let them separate out and say, I've got to some way focus on the business and I'll get to the diversity issues later on. You've got to say, these are inextricably tied together.
Ken, thank you so much for joining us. This has been extraordinary. Thank you to everyone who helped get you here and supported us. I'm going to pass it off to Andrea's Culture Shift partner, Denmark West.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolyn, and definitely thank you, Ken. I really hope everyone attending enjoyed this as much as I did. I found this discussion both exciting and inspiring. And as a side note, for those of you who don't already know, Caroline leads a podcast for Black Enterprise called On the Clock. So please check her out if you haven't done that already. She has discussions like these weekly. While there were a number of notable pearls of wisdom, takeaways in this conversation, I just want to highlight you in the 1 minute I want to take here. We all realize that we're experiencing a time of unprecedented uncertainty and disruption. So it's important that we first understand the challenges and opportunities that we face. Second, that we lead with purpose, decisiveness, and empathy. Third, that we come together as a community to support one another both personally and professionally as mentors, partners, co-conspirators, and friends, with real desire to move in a collective force. Fourth, that we not focus on going back to normal as much as reimagining the future and what this potentially become. And fifth and finally, that we hold people and organizations accountable and creating a shared accountability to foster not only inclusion, but also responsibility for the results of the disruptive innovation that may be caused by reimagining the world. With that, I not only want to thank you as attendees for being here, and I not only want to thank Carolyn and Ken for this brilliant and inspiring conversation, I also want to thank RBC and SAP for providing the support that was necessary to make this possible. And with that said, I'd like to bring back Judith Williams from SAP for the final word.
Thank you, Denmark, and thanks again to Ken and Caroline. I am once again inspired and I am engaged. So on behalf of SAP and RBC Capital Markets, we thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us.